Sure. All right, we're on page Lamed Chet we're towards the end of Shav'ah, and page 71 in English. And Shav'ah is defined again as the hysterical outcry. The mode of prayer which we distinguished between Shav'ah and Bitzur, as the sort of the panic-stricken, the desperation that we feel in a moment when we don't know what's going to be tomorrow, how we're going to get through this crisis. Your hands will be with me through business. This is what he's requesting. We're up to the next paragraph. I apologize. Right. A and C. This was the way of the earlier ones who came before us. Every service they had before Hashem, they would always try to do something to the fullest extent that they could. David put in all of his strength for Hashem. We're actually reviewing page 70 now. Sorry, David was dancing before God with all of his koach. How wondrous is this verse? The Torah, which explores the depths of everyone's innards. David put everything into his dance. When the Aron, the Holy Ark, returned to the Jewish people from the Plishtim, David danced with everything he had. Yadua b'teva shebeshas sakana, and it is known that when you are in danger, you're running away from fire, God forbid. It reveals in mankind secret latent powers that we didn't know existed. Adrenaline, physical, emotional strength. You could suddenly lift up big packages and suddenly skip over mountains, right? The pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, the voice of my beloved is coming. He's skipping over mountains and valleys. Describes the process of Yetzias Mitzrayim as being supernatural. We jumped over steps of redemption. We went right to Geula. And that's the type of supernatural effect that we can have when we're in crisis. But David, that all the strength that David had in his soul, everything he could muster, David used in his dance. Right? It was the greatest dance ever. He was dancing before God. It was an all-consuming fire. The combination of fear and joy, love, ahava, all of them were without limits. Amazing description of what a lesser author would have said, and then David danced. Right? He put everything into it. He was on fire, consumed with passion and love and awe. Chen Amar Chazal. And Chazal said like this as well. We're now at the bottom of 70. We would run before Hashem like horses galloping over a brook. They went above their nature. The horses are frightened; they're going to fall into the brook, right? That has the stream going by, so they gallop over it. Kain ahava so yisparach. That's what the Gemara says was the love that he experienced for Hashem. Bara b'leiva avos keish, that burned in the hearts of the kadmonim, of the earlier avot, b'nei hapachad, because of the fear. lest they descend into the pit of darkness. So you put all your kochot, all your energies into something when you feel that you have everything to lose, when you're at a moment and your back is up against the wall. And so there is a spiritual adrenaline that we have to tap into, that is Shava. In our eyes, Inyanenu rather, it's much simpler. When you think about what are you davening for, purify our hearts to serve you in truth. Without this, why do we even have life? Having a pure heart is more important than anything else in the world, and therefore I have nothing better to live for. Without this, I will fall into a pit of Gehenna, where every moment is worse than all the suffering in this world combined. And if all of the pain in the world were to suddenly fall in my lap, and that sometimes life feels like that, like sometimes we feel as if everything is hitting us all at once. And if that were to happen, right, if all the suffering in the world were suddenly to be thrown on my shoulders, wouldn't we cry like crazy? Wouldn't we be mishtageh, like to go nuts, to request from God to help you? So too, when you are mavakesh, welcome Anat. When you are mavakesh, bana beischa kivat tchila. We are building b'nei beischa kivat tchila, the pasuk that we recite in Musaf on Yontif. B'nei beischa kivat tchila, v'chonim mikdash ha'amachono. Build your house as it was in the very beginning. How much do we have to feel in our prayers? By this thought, right? If our mouths were filled with crying and calling out, kiyam lo yas, like a sea of water, lo yaspik bichdi levakesh bakasha kazu. You would not have enough sufficient words or emotion for this request. So he's describing now something that makes him, the author, sense that there is urgency. For instance, on Musaf, on Yontif, when we call out that God should rebuild the temple, it's never enough energy that we put into that tefillah. It's not enough emotion, fire that burns when we say it. Chinam Chazal, our Rabbi Akiva, mitas Rabbi Eliezer Agadol. When Rabbi Akiva saw that Rabbi Eliezer died, sorrow. He used to hit his own flesh. We don't do this. We don't hit our own flesh anymore. But he would sort of whipped himself or hit himself until Ajadamo Shoshes Laretz, until his blood fell out to the ground. And Tosafos says, how can you create lacerations? There's the Ferish mitzvah in the Torah. It says lo titgodedu. Lo titgodedu literally means don't make lacerations on your skin. And Chazal also darshan lo titgodedu refers to not making divisions in Klal Yisrael. So if you're davening, so for instance, if you are davening, if you're davening in one minyan, and all of a sudden someone takes on another custom, right? So the debate is, are you allowed to start doing different customs in one minyan? That's called lo tisgodedu. But the literal interpretation of lo tisgodedu is one is not permitted to make lacerations on their body, because it used to be the Darkei Amori, the ways of the idolaters were that when someone lo aleinu would die, they would scratch their skin, right? Unfortunately, sometimes people who are depressed will go through emotional challenges. They harm themselves, they hurt themselves, they scratch their skin. Kids do it. It's a telltale sign that something's wrong with the child. So we're prohibited in the Torah from making lacerations on our skin when someone dies, from pulling our hair out. We're not allowed to do that. That's considered a way of avodah zarah. So the Gemara, the Sanhedrin says that Rabbi Akiva, when he saw Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol died, and they carried his Aron out in front of him, he lost it. He completely fell apart. And he started to hit his own flesh until blood came out. So Tosafos says, how could he have done that? How could Rabbi Akiva have harmed himself when Rabbi Eliezer died? Isn't that a prohibition in the Torah called lo tisgo to do? Are you not allowed to do that? Tirtzu v'tosas dal divrei Torah mutter. Apparently, Tosafos says something, a big chiddush, that when it comes to the loss of Torah, one is permitted to cause harm to their own skin, their own body, to mourn that loss. It's a wild Tosafos. Take that for a second. That means that God forbid, right? God forbid if a Torah giant dies, right? And we lost countless already, can't even keep track anymore last year. I mean, there's just a toll that we haven't been able to begin to quantify yet. Does that mean that we should start cutting ourselves? God forbid. Rabbi Akiva did it for Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol. So how do we understand that? So the Shearim BeTefila cites an insight here from Rav Chaim Shmulevitz of blessed memory. Shamati bira inim b'shem Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. Sheyesod ha'isser delo tisgodu ksiv l'fana b'Torah. Banim atem shomkeichem lo tisgod. Look at the whole context of the verse. I'm going to highlight it here for you on the screen. The context of the verse of lo tisgodu. So it says, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. You are God's children. Do not harm yourself. Do not cut yourself on behalf of the dead. So what's the context of lo tisgodu? You are God's children. It's always important in drasha, whenever you're making inferences in the Torah, to understand context. So it says in Chaim Shmulevitz, when a person harms themselves because of personal grief, because they were close with the deceased, showing I'm missing that person, a parent, a relative, a sibling, right? And you can't live without them. You create you harm your own body because I'm now missing that person. Chayav einam chayim. Life is not life anymore. That's the emotion of a person who cuts themselves when they're in pain. This life is not worth living. That's why it's a frightening sign when someone is depressed. If they have cuts on their arm, because they're basically crying, life is not worth it. This is not life. Remember, you're God's children. How could you say that your life is not a life? How could you argue that your life is not worth living? So he says, don't you know how much God loves you? We never got this right in Judaism. The Christians figured it out. They formed a whole religion based on God's love for his people. And we just told everyone, just do mitzvahs, just don't worry about it. Or make sure you eat a kazayas in 9 minutes, shove the matzah down your throat, and swallow all of it before you talk, and then God will love you. We forgot about this part. Kadosh Baruch Hu loves you. You are God's children. He's also close to you while you're observing halacha. Here's the deal. If you lost a relative, if you're grieving a personal pain, you're not allowed to harm yourself. Because the statement that life is not life without that person is unfair. Because you do have God, and he still loves you as much as it's painful. But if you've lost Torah, if a great scholar or a volume of Torah was lost, if hundreds of cartloads of Talmud were burnt in the town square in Paris, then it says Tosfos. I'm not saying we pass them like this. If a Sefer Torah drops in the shul, God forbid, we shouldn't start cutting our skin. But Tosfos says it would be permissible. Why? Because the loss of Torah is that fundamental, paramount to your own sense of existence. And then mutter gam l'chol b'atzmo. That's why Rabbi Akiva was permitted to harm himself in that case. Right. Now, why is he going on this tangent? Because the last few words, kol shekain. And if, according to Tosfos, you would be allowed to harm yourself, God forbid, if Torah was ripped out of your life, because that would actually cause the quality of life to depreciate. Kol shekain tzarich lishtaged b'chiyal zeh. Going crazy in your prayer is the appropriate mode on the loss of Torah.
Rabbi, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
I don't understand how Rabbi Akiva could think that he lost Torah. Isn't he a great Torah scholar? You know, he lost his rabbi, he lost his teacher, but doesn't he still have it? Didn't he have many, many students?
Yeah, no, and I think that every generation they look at the previous generation as if they possessed so much more than they did, and that from our perspective, you know, it's Rabbi Akiva is so great. In fact, to us, he's probably more famous than Rabbi Eliezer Agadol. Rabbi Eliezer preceded him in the Mishnah, but Rabbi Eliezer is his Rebbe, and so from Rabbi Akiva's perspective, a greater loss of Torah took place. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Okay, so, but we also, it's easy historically to fall into the trap of, Rashi and Rambam and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs are all rabbis, Like it's easy to fall into that trap where we kind of just equate everyone in history into one entity and don't understand that the Yeridat Hadorot means that there was, that the amount of Torah and knowledge and wisdom that was possessed in one generation makes the next subsequent generation pale in comparison typically. So that's the way we see it. Okay, but tzarich la'avin, we have to understand. Habechi hagadol shel Rabbi Akiva, the great cry of Rabbi Akiva, v'yiusho me'achayim, and the anguish from life, al shenechsar lo toraso, that Torah was missing in his life. So Rabbi Eliezer Gadol, al bishu atzmo gadol tanaim, even though, as Shira just pointed out astutely, that Rabbi Akiva himself was no slouch. In Ken Kol Shekain Anu, all the more so us. So lo Tanaim, we're not Tanaim, we're not Amoraim. We don't appear in the Mishnayos, we don't appear in the Gemara. And all the more so for each of us, right, who are on that level. Avlishu Atzma Yagadol Tanaim. In Ken Kol Shekain Anu Shanu lo Tanaim lo Amoraim, we're not Tanaim, we're not Amoraim. Lo Rishonim lo Acharonim, we're not the first generation, we're not living in the time of the year 1000 to 1200, 1300. We're not Achronim. We don't live in the 1400s to 1500s. Who are we? We're missing in our lives a heder mekadesh Hashem, a deficiency of the sanctity of the name of God. If the temple were still around, and we were halachically living in the time of Tanoim, that it says in Eicha in the second chapter that her kings and her ministers are exiled among her nations. There is no Torah. Look what Yirmiyahu bemoans when he talks about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Kings, ministers, all being banished, and finally there is no Torah. Yirmiyahu understood that was the ultimate crisis for the Jew, the loss of Torah, the loss of study of Torah. Biggest crisis we're facing right now is that we have basically banished children from shuls for a year, right? So they spend their weeks on Zoom, on devices, and come Shabbos Kodesh and they stay at home. I understand everyone's panicked that kids are going to be these wild spreaders of diseases, but we have to consider the toll of the loss of that Torah, that impact right there. And we're not going to be able to understand it for a few years. A whole year of of shul, and then all the kids are going to say, we think they're going to be lining up at the door, right? Eager to get their lollipops and their little group leaders will say, but I think a lot of them are just going to either say, hey, you know what, I'm staying home, or I'm terrified of shul, because that's the place where people die. Even though we haven't had a single transmission of COVID in shul, but okay. Shul is the only dangerous place in the world. Everything else is fine. Political rallies, go ahead, do what you got to do. But daven at shul 20 feet apart from someone else with a mask on, quietly, and that's a wild spreader of disease. All right, but anyway, in Ezut Tzara Nitzchis, you tell we have a hand raised. Go ahead, Anat. So we have to understand that Rabbi Akiva, why was he so despondent? Why was he despairing life? Wasn't he a great rabbi himself? And we ourselves, even if we were living the time Tanaim, we would not amount to the level of Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, because the destruction of the temple is associated with the loss of the Torah, as Yirmiyahu stipulates in Eicha, therefore we have to experience that kind of pain and anguish. He's giving us an impetus to cry out in anguish and hysterically every time we daven. Because every time we daven, essentially, we recognize there are no karbanot, there's no Beit HaMikdash, and most of Tefillah was instituted as a replacement for those things. In Epshitahu de Madrega Zu, this level, Betsura Zu, in this form of Tefillah, Gidoleh is so great, the Niskava Meitano Me'od, and it is above us, right? Niskava Meitano. It's above us. But, Aval Be'emes, Kol Echad Yachol Lingo Aval, page 73, second paragraph. But all of us can touch this. The low, unlike a song, MC Hammer. The low, the mikzas lishtamesh, ba betfilaso. All of us can attain that level in our davening. And we're not talking about fake crying, fake fetching, like the Chazanim of old who they invented the krechs. Krechs is an artificial show of emotion in the middle of your davening. You kind of yell out an oi in the middle of davening, and you repeat words and make them nonsensical. A real cry, a deep cry. That man should understand in their mind. How can you understand your inner shouting? Why there's urgency? Why in the privacy of your heart? Why it's worthy for you to cry like this. Really penetrate the depths and understand the deficiency of Torah and of the temple in your life. It's not that hard if you try. It's like the reverse of the song that the terrible song "Imagine" by John Lennon, right? Where he talks about how imagine the world where there's no religion, there's no this, and this sort of utopian society of everyone, a brotherhood of man. It sounds wonderful, except there's no cause and effect. There's no reason to live anymore, and there's no religion. There's no religion. There's no God. He thinks that's a wonderful thing, but it's not. He says it's not that hard to imagine if you really want what it means to recognize what you're missing. To see that the daily existence without a central location of Shekhinah, of God, is a deficient life. And that the loss of Torah is akin to that. The Gemara says the loss of a Talmid Chacham is like the loss of a temple. And that's why Rabbi Akiva is in a status of anguish. He's trying to depict physically what it means to experience anguish. For Akaz Rabbi Chaim of Lashon, Binyan al-Limud. The story was that Reb Chaim Volozhiner, that when he would learn in an hour, most people couldn't learn in 10 hours. I saw there was a kind of cute thing, a conversation between Rabbi Shlomo Katz, the musician, and Rav Asher Weiss, one of the Gedolei Hador. And I was thinking in my head, my cynical side kind of clicked and said, okay, why are these two together? One's a musician and one's the Gedolei Hador. While this one's singing Yismechu v'malchuscha, the other one can learn Shas and Poskim in the same time. But anyway, it was actually a sweet conversation. They actually brought out some interesting points. But they say about Chaim Volozhiner that when he was studying, right, that you could learn in that hour that which other people could not even learn in 10 hours. Kol lefi rov hazrizus. Everything is dependent upon the extent to which a person is putting in their effort. Same thing as tefillah. If you get a moment of clarity in your prayer, how your soul is so deeply affected by tefillah, just for a few moments of that, if you touch that paradise of pure tefillah, if you've ever been there, you know what that's like. It's incredible, right? It's a majestic feeling. It feels like otherworldly. At kol kochotav b'tefillah, when you completely subliminate everything you have, you give it over to prayer. Like a crazy person. A person who's lost their mind in prayer. That all I want is to be close to you. All I want is your Torah. All I want is your eminence. God forbid if you're going through a crisis. You'll muster all the strength you have in that one moment. All of this is that you shouldn't is without being recognized in the outside, shum tenu azara, without any foreign movement, without any unusual movement that can be discerned from the outside. Right? The Hasidim Rishon are criticized by the Misnagdim for doing somersaults and flips and things like that in their tefillah, even though that's what David HaMelech did. Because to really connect to God, you don't actually have to move. Right? It's all in the heart, it's all in the mind. You could be there. So even without doing those things, Chana, the mother of all tefillos, of all mitpalim, utters the most impactful tefillah that we know about on Rosh Hashanah without moving their lips. People now daven without moving their lips. That's also because no one's watching and they just have their masks on top. You don't do anything. Anyway, just stand there. But you can utter the greatest tefillos without even moving. No one on the outside recognizes the inner turmoil, the inner desire. How precious is that moment? Shakala, in a brief moment, how close you can come to God in just a little moment of tefillah. And what understanding you have of God's love and connection and His providence, His divine hand steering us. And when you do have a moment like this, then it will be imbued in your heart. And you will try with all of your strength until it becomes second nature. In other words, you think you have this transcendent experience of the one tefillah that was better than any other tefillah, the one time you daven better than anyone else, right? But the reality is that once you do this, you can do it every time. Tefillah could become transcendent and otherworldly anytime you want. You have to be willing to cry like crazy for that which really matters, that which your life is dependent upon. For him, obviously, the author is expressing, for him, that's Torah. But it could be any tzara, it could be any crisis, any need. And it goes up and up. Follow Hashem like a lion roars. So to summarize the second gate of prayer, Shava, it takes this idea of Bitzor to the next level, because Bitzor, calling out in distress, quantifies it from the outside, the broken heart, the passionate plea, right? Shava is not organized. You're not in control. it's giving up a sense of physical control, almost, no, I wouldn't say animalistic, but spiritual. You can give up physical control by becoming animalistic, right? Descending into the pit of depravity and physical urges, such that you no longer are human in control, and you can give up that side in a spiritual sense, right? The two sides of it's dangerous. I mean, people do this with drugs all the time. You can do it with tefillah, right? He's describing shava as this desperate clamoring that where you no longer are conscientious of, where you're saying that without this one thing, my life is worthless. What is that thing? What is that thing that you'd be willing to completely get lost in the prayer? You'd be on fire. You give up everything to that moment, where you don't care what anyone else thinks, right? Like a David who's dancing, and that's the emotion of Shava, and that's one of the 10 or 13 types of prayer that we have to try to work on. And this is something that is not just a one-time experience, a one-time kumsitz. It's a transcendent experience that you could tap into every time you pray. And the third type of tefillah, right, that is really similar, and it's really not a long chapter at all, is called tza'aka. We'll just begin tza'aka. Tza'aka is a cry, but it's described in English on page 75 as a wordless scream. It's a scream that has no words to it, right? If you remember, you described the shofar as having this, either the three-part teruah, which is shavarim, the broken cry, or the staccato teruah, but either of those have a break in the middle. And I once heard described the break in the middle of the teruah is the most powerful moment in the cry. You know when a baby is crying, and they're just inconsolable, and they're going on and on and on, and they can't catch their breath, and they're silent for a second as they're in the middle of their cries. That silent pause, the silent pause in the middle of the teruah, that's tza'aka. Tza'aka is the cry that can't be heard. Tza'aka is the cry that only God hears. And the Bnei Israel called out from their bondage, from their servitude, and they screamed out. Let's define tza'aka. And I have to cut early today because I have, fortunately, some sad business to deal with someone in the shul whose relative is very sick. So I will get off the line in a few moments. Tza'aka hi kasher alev so'er me'utzemet. Tza'aka is when the heart is so agitated. Me'utzemet noraot habakasha. From the grave intensity of the plea. So it's almost the next level after Shava. You don't even have the words. Shava is the all-consuming fire of the words that express, right, that anguish. And Tza'aka is bli milim. There are no words. Think about Aaron when his sons died. What does the Torah say about Aaron? Vayidom Aaron. He was silent, nothing to say. Tragic event. Eulogies should always invoke Aaron, because anyone who thinks they have the words that can properly summarize the pain and the loss, the profundity of what's happened, don't put it to words. Tza'aka is more powerful. Sometimes no words. You ever pay a shiva call and you're scrambling to know what to say? I'm so sorry. And people sometimes say really just thoughtless things like, so was he sick for a while? Well, I don't want to recount the whole illness to you, right? No, tell me, describe the pain and the suffering. No, just sit there with the person. Say nothing. Sometimes silent communication is powerful. Tza'aka is silent communication. And just a voice. And what's amazing about a voice without, what is amazing about a voice without words is it's pure, right? Kadosh Baruch Hu created us with a voice by putting Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. He put a soul into us, and on Rosh Hashanah we declare His Malchus with a solitary sound, with no words. Why are words on a lower level than a voice? A kol comes from deeper, it comes from inside. The Gemara says that once we take the voice, the inarticulate voice, and we start to chop it up with syllables and language and accents and things like that, we destroy a pure voice. This is why Hasidim are so into the nigun, because the melody is so much deeper than one that is divided up by words. The Gemara says that when you start to, the heart understands, and then all of a sudden the peh is chotech, the lashon is mechatech, and the peh gomer. The lashon cuts up the words with the various syllables. You know how you use different parts of your mouth to pronounce different letters? Secret is dental. Daled, nun, tet, or taf, lamet, dental. Those are the letters that you use with your teeth. Dental. Daled, nun, tes. So each part of your mouth, and there are words that are used chikiim, words that use the back of your throat, words that use the tongue, letters that require different parts of your mouth to pronounce. Every letter in the Hebrew alphabet requires different parts of the mouth to produce. But deeper than any of that is a voice that doesn't require articulation and division. That's why language is such a divisive thing, because it's chotech, says the Gemara. It divides between different people. Accents, pronunciation, meaning, intent, and language. Those are the most divisive things in the world. That's why when we were building a beautiful tower together, right, a big, beautiful wall, big, beautiful tower, and what happened? We couldn't talk anymore because the languages were changed and the tower came crumbling down. So language divides. But what unites? Melody. A melody. They say about Rav Yehuda Amital Zal, one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Har Tzion, that the year in 73, when many of his Talmidim died, a good number of them died in the war, right, Yom Kippur, and as a result, he was in a Mara Shechora. He was in a how do you translate Mara Shechora? Like a darkness, a depression for the year, and he wasn't his usual self. And it wasn't until Purim time that he started to be revived a little bit, as Rav Amital was. And he gathered with the Talmidim in the yeshiva, and his first talk to them really, which showed signs of healing and beginning to find his own traction again, he pointed out that the root of all nigunim, the root of all melodies, is called nidre. And right before Purim, he starts to sing, and as they began to sing again, the healing began in the room. And the story is that it was the nigun, it was the melody that brought Rav Amital back into the yeshiva again. The melody connects you back to your root. He says this is an old melody. It's the root of all tunes, the root of all simcha. So what happens when we start to put words? We start to assign words to things. Yes, it gives it meaning, but meaning is so definitive. It's so definitive that it also excludes. And this is a little bit off track, but I'm going to make an important point here. Tza'aka is deeper than words, and therefore it has a far-reaching capacity. Right? We should start in school, before we teach kids words to Adon Olam, we should teach them the tune. The problem is the tune to Adon Olam is not necessarily sacred. It's probably some German marching band or whatever, marching song that they used to kill us to that tune, and now we sing it to Adon Olam when we go to Kiddush. Adon Olam, get the Jew, go get the Kiddush. Come on, time to get some herring, gefilte fish. So whatever. But the point is that nigunim are a powerful way to connect. They're not subject to divisiveness. And so that's why the deepest prayer is the Zohar says that the most powerful kind of prayer is the voice. Chaviva yi mikol ofnei tefila. It's more beloved than any kind of tefillah. U'amina chozeret rekam. And the wordless expression never comes back empty-handed. And with that, we will conclude today. And I apologize